What's the real reason you dumped a girl? Story about date with pixels. We started dating completely by accident. We met at a party at a mutual friend's house, got to talking, and realized that we had a lot in common. The first dates were perfect. We walked in parks, discussed movies and books, had lunch in cozy cafes. Everything was like a romantic story from a movie, until I noticed one strange detail. On every date, her phone was always with her, not just next to her, but always in her hands. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. We all check messages or social media sometimes, but each time it started to become more and more obvious and annoying. We could be sitting in a beautiful restaurant, enjoying the view, but instead of talking to me, she was immersively flipping through her phone screen. I tried to strike up a conversation, sharing my thoughts and ideas, but each time she was distracted, as if something important was happening in her virtual world. It was as if her attention was divided between me and this device. We could sit next to each other, but I felt like I was alone. Once, when we were at the movie theater, she didn't even take her eyes off the phone for a moment. I was sitting watching a movie in complete darkness with her smartphone screen flickering next to me. It was disrupting not only the atmosphere, but also my perception of our relationship. I began to feel that I was communicating not with her, but with this device. Each time I wondered more and more, what does this mean for us? Why is she more interested in being on her phone than being here with me? Maybe I'm just boring to her, and she's looking for something more exciting in the digital world. These thoughts kept me on my toes, but I continued to be patient, hoping that this was just a temporary phase, that she would soon realize how much more important live communication is. On one of our dates, when she was once again engrossed in her phone, I suddenly realized that I was looking at her like a stranger, a person who is physically present, but her thoughts and feelings are far away, just a tap of the screen away. I tried to imagine what it would be like to live with someone who would always be preoccupied with something else, something impossible to understand or feel. It was a terrifying feeling of being alone next to someone who should be close. It was the moment I finally realized I can't do this anymore. I need someone who will be with me not only physically, but also in spirit, who will appreciate the moments we spend together and not replace them with virtual reality. Story about the heaviness of lightness. When we first met, she seemed to me the epitome of kindness and sincerity. Her naivety was so rare and almost childlike that I was enchanted. She was a girl who saw the world through the prism of simplicity and purity, and there was something delightful about that. She laughed at simple jokes, marveled at things that most people had long ago stopped noticing, and in her eyes I could read the genuine wonder of each new day. At first I felt like her mentor, happy to explain things to her that were obvious to me. Her questions were sometimes so simple and direct that I just smiled and explained again. I loved sharing my knowledge with her, my observations. Her sincerity was refreshing and her enthusiasm was contagious. But as time went on, I began to notice that this naivete was growing into something more. When she didn't understand basic things, it became a little alarming. She could overlook obvious things, fail to understand simple logical connections. Each time, her questions became more ridiculous and my explanations more frequent. She could spend the whole day asking me questions about the most ordinary things that didn't even require an explanation. I tried to be patient at first. After all, her sincerity and naivete still seemed sweet to me. I tried to explain to her, to teach her, hoping that in time she would begin to understand better, that it was just a matter of time. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized that her perception of the world was so limited that it was starting to get tiresome. I had to say the same thing several times over, and even then she didn't always understand what I meant. Walking, which used to be a source of joy and inspiration for me, began to cause me internal stress. I began to feel like I was around someone who lived in her own small, isolated world, and that world was too narrow for both of us. One day, when we were discussing something simple, she again asked a question that was so absurd that I stopped for a moment. In that moment, it hit me. I was tired of having to constantly explain basic things to her, of not being able to share my thoughts and feelings with her on a level that I consider natural. Her simplicity, which used to seem so sweet to me, had become a burden I could no longer carry. Story about the sound of disappointment. We met by chance, as it often happens. Friends in common, an evening in a bar, a slight flirtation. Everything seemed quite ordinary and even promising. She was an intelligent, interesting interesting conversationalist, and we immediately found a lot of common topics for conversation. The first meeting went perfectly. We laughed a lot, shared stories, and I went home with the feeling that something nice was brewing on the horizon. At the second meeting, I was even more confident about our prospects. We chose a cozy cafe in the city center, ordered coffee, and again plunged into conversation. Everything was going smoothly until I decided to make a joke. The joke was light, not pretending to be the wittiest, but funny enough to bring a smile to my face. I waited for her reaction with slight trepidation, and suddenly she laughed. That laugh, I had never heard anything like it. It wasn't just a laugh, it was some kind of shrill squeak that turned into a squeal, like someone had stepped on a pig's tail. I was shocked. At first I thought it was just an accident. Maybe she choked, or just decided to lighten the atmosphere with an unusual sound. But her face expressed genuine joy, and I realized it was her usual laughter. I tried to pretend that everything was all right, that I wasn't embarrassed at all, but the sound pierced my head like fingernails scraping a chalkboard. I couldn't concentrate on the conversation, just waiting for her to laugh again, and she laughed. Again, that squeal that made my nerves shake. The sound seemed to cut through the air and straight into my ears, making them throb with tension. Every time I said something funny, or even just amusing, her laughter came back like a horrible echo that I couldn't get rid of. I tried to shift my attention to something else, tried to think about how beautiful she was or how nice it was to talk to her, but every time she laughed, all my thoughts instantly disappeared, leaving room for only one question: how am I going to live with that sound? With each date, that laughter became more and more unbearable for me. I knew I should tell her about it, but I couldn't. How can you tell someone that their natural reaction to joy makes you almost physically disgusted? I tried joking less often, avoiding situations where she might laugh, but it was impossible. Her laughter was so natural and genuine that even the simplest things could cause that horrible sound. At some point, I started avoiding her. I made excuses to cancel meetings, found excuses not to respond to her messages right away. I knew it wasn't fair to her, but I couldn't help myself. Her laughter was relentless in my head, and it literally drove me crazy. The last time we met was in the park. I already knew it would be our last date. We walked around, talking about something neutral, and I tried to keep my cool, but I still couldn't help myself and said something funny. Her laughter echoed over the trees like a distress siren. I realized I couldn't take it anymore. A story about when the heart forgets. The day I heard this story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was during one of the usual family dinners when relatives get together, discuss their lives, and share news. We were laughing, joking, enjoying each other as we always do. But suddenly, one of my relatives told me about a coworker of his, and his story changed the atmosphere dramatically. This man had been happily married for over a decade. He and his wife raised their children, built their life on the basis of love and mutual understanding. No one could have imagined that one day it would all come crashing down, but something happened that could not have been foreseen. He had a stroke. It was a stroke that not only destroyed his physical health, but also completely changed his personality. After the stroke, he became a different person. It wasn't just a mood swing or a temporary condition. He stopped loving his loved ones, those who had been dear to him all his life. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, he began to feel hatred for them. It was unexpected and painful for his family, who were trying to understand what was going on. His wife and children tried to help him, to care for him as they had before, but nothing could bring back the man they knew. It wasn't just a loss of connection, it was a loss of the love and warmth that had bound them together for so many years. He divorces his wife, leaving her utterly confused. The children who had recently been his pride were suddenly strangers to him. It was as if he had erased all his former life from his memory and started a new one, in which there was no place for those who were dear to him. This change was not limited to his family. At work, he became a completely different person as well. Colleagues he had worked with for years no longer recognized him. He became cold, aloof, and sometimes aggressive. The work that had once brought him satisfaction now made him angry and resentful. He was no longer interested in his projects or the people around him. Instead, he withdrew into himself, sinking into a world of loneliness and rejection. It was a shock to everyone around me. How could a man who had been so caring and loving change so much? No one knew the answer. The story of hygiene of disappointment. We met in a cozy cafe where dusk was slowly descending outside the window, and the air was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She was attractive, with sparkling eyes and a lively lively mind. Her ease and charm drew me in immediately. We talked about life, future plans, things that inspire us. Things were going as well as they could, and I felt something special budding between us. We seemed to understand each other perfectly, and the evening was becoming more and more enjoyable. At one point, she said she needed to wash her hands. I nodded in understanding, expecting her to get up and go to the sink. However, what happened next changed everything in an instant. Without leaving the table, she just spit on her hands and started rubbing them together like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stared at her in shock, unable to believe my eyes. All the romance that was in the air was instantly gone. It was that moment when reality hit me like a cold shower. Thoughts were scrolling through my head at an incredible speed. Before, I had perceived her as a sophisticated, attractive woman with the ability to inspire and attract. But this simple and seemingly insignificant gesture shattered the entire image I had managed to create. All the attraction I felt for her suddenly evaporated. Everything inside me turned upside down, and I couldn't see her the same way I had before. I tried to convince myself that it was just a small thing, that I shouldn't pay attention to it. But no matter how hard I tried, that moment was forever etched in my memory. It wasn't just an action, it was a symbol of something much bigger. I began to doubt that perhaps I was being overly critical or even unfair, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Our evening continued, but without the ease and pleasant excitement that had been there at the beginning. I tried to get the conversation back on track, to find a topic that might reignite interest, but every time I looked at her, I remembered that gesture, and disappointment grew in me. A story about a life lesson in biology. When I think back to my school years, many different moments come to mind, from carefree jokes at recess to serious exams that made us nervous. But one day has remained in my memory especially vividly. It was an ordinary biology class where we had to dissect frogs. The task was certainly not for the faint of heart, but it was mandatory, and we all realized that we had to do it. No one expected this day to be so memorable, especially because of one person. She was one of the brightest personalities in the class, always cheerful, outgoing, with an infectious laugh that could lift the spirits of even the dullest day. But in this class, her laughter took on something different, dark and strange. The teacher explained the procedure to us, showing us how to properly dissect a frog to examine its internal organs. Everyone in the class, holding back mild disgust, got to work. I myself was nervous, trying to perform the task carefully so as not to cause unnecessary damage. The smell of formalin wafted through the air, mingling with the nervous whispers of the students. And then, when everyone was absorbed in their thoughts and actions, she suddenly began to laugh. It was not the usual joyous laughter we are used to. It was a hoarse, almost hysterical laughter that caught the attention of everyone in the class. Her face was lit up with a strange gaiety, and a sharp knife gleamed in her hands. She began stabbing the dead frog with a kind of wild energy, laughing louder and louder. It was something shocking that immediately overwhelmed everyone. At this point, her laughter and movements were so far removed from the fun-loving gal we all knew. She seemed to be immersed in her own world where this frog was the object of her frenzied merriment. It seemed that every stabbing of the animal's body brought her some perverse pleasure. The teacher noticed her behavior and moved closer, trying to stop her and bring her back to reality. But there was a smile on her face and sparks of some kind of incomprehensible amusement in her eyes. The rest of the students froze, not knowing what to do. No one had expected such a turn of events. My mind was racing with thoughts. How could she be so happy about something so creepy? Was this a manifestation of a hidden side of her that none of us had seen before? Or was it just a way to relieve the stress of an unpleasant task? But something about her laughter and the manner in which she wielded the knife was frightening. After that incident, her behavior no longer struck me as harmless. Story about a date in the shadow of symbols. Our first date began quite normally. We met in a cozy cafe in the city center, where the soft light of the lamps and quiet music created the perfect atmosphere for a leisurely conversation. She was smart, interesting, with a subtle sense of humor, which immediately attracted me. But after a few minutes, I began to notice something strange in her behavior. She was scrutinizing my every move, as if I were a subject of study. At first, it didn't make me uncomfortable. I thought it was just her way of talking, her desire to understand me better. But then, the situation began to take a different turn. When I reached for my fork to taste the dish, her eyes widened. widened, and she said something about how my choice of cutlery reflected my attitude toward life. I smiled, not giving it much thought, and turned the conversation to another topic. However, the further we talked, the more I began to notice that she attached importance to literally every action I took. If I accidentally dropped a napkin, it was a sign of worry or doubt to her. If I looked out the window, it was a reason to think long and hard about what was going on in my head. She believed that behind every gesture, behind every word, there was a deep meaning that she had to unravel. As time went on, her analyses became more and more tedious. Instead of a light and pleasant conversation, our meetings turned into an incessant process of interpretation. It was as if she were finding hidden meanings even where there were none. I felt as if I were in an exam, where every action I took was being evaluated and deciphered. This caused me inner tension, and I could no longer relax in her company. Every date we went on became a challenge. I tried to be as natural as possible, but the more I tried, the more she saw hidden meanings in my actions. I couldn't just enjoy the moment anymore. All the time I was thinking about how she was interpreting my gestures, and it was robbing me of the opportunity to be myself. After a few encounters, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. Instead of feeling comfortable and free, I felt a constant pressure. It seemed to me that there was an invisible barrier between us, her desire to find something in simple things that wasn't there. One evening, when we were sitting in the same cafe again, I realized that I didn't want to continue these meetings. We sat in silence, and I realized that our communication had turned into an endless guessing game that I could never win. My every look, every gesture became the subject of her analysis, and it took away all the joy of communication. At that moment, I realized that our perception of the world was too different. She saw symbols where there were none, and this prevented her from seeing the real me. I didn't want to be a mystery to be solved. I wanted to just be me, without interpretation or hidden meanings.